Welcome everyone, and my name, as you can see from the screen, is Tom Stoneham, and I'm currently in the city of York in the UK at the University of York, but I'll explain a bit more about myself as we get going. So let me start sharing my screen and we will go through the session today. So hopefully you can all see that. And this is our title today. We're talking about normative constraints on responsible AI, law, society, and ethics in particular. Who I am? As I said, my name's Tom Stoneham. That image you can see on there is a portrait of me produced in the style of the artist Tobias Gutmann by an AI he developed called Faceomat. Some people think it's a good likeness. Anyway, so I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of York. I'm currently head of department as well. Academically, my areas of interest are data privacy and AI ethics. I run a master's program in applied ethics and governance of data privacy. And I'm the ethics lead on a center for doctoral training in safety assurance of AI-enabled autonomous systems, which has 12 PhD students a year coming into it in all disciplines to work on this very important problem. So as you can see, I'm probably going to talk most about ethics rather than law and society today, but there will be some important exploration of that in the middle, and I will explain why I've chosen that emphasis as well. So the plan for the talk today is I'm going to talk a little bit about who decides what's right and wrong. Then I'm going to explain a little bit about what ethical theory is. What do we mean by normative frameworks? Which we'll explore by looking at some Venn diagrams to see how the concepts of law, society, and ethics relate to each other. And then I want to talk a little bit about moral perfectionism, and we'll end with some opportunities for you to reflect yourself on your own practices as you work in the area of AI and data. So that's the plan. I tend to talk too much, so it's going to take quite a long time for me to get through all this, but I will aim to have some time for questions at the end. If there's any urgent questions or technical issues, feel free to pop them in the chat. I've got the chat up on another screen, so I'll see them appear. So I want to start with an example of a real life problem in AI ethics. So lots of people have smart microphones. Well, they're kind of smart, sometimes called smart speakers, but it's the microphone aspect we're interested in here. Like Alexa, that's Google's smart microphone. Or if you have Apple devices, you'll have Siri. Alexa is Amazon's smart microphone. Siri or Google Now. And these are designed to continually listen for the keywords which trigger them, which start them. So you say, Alexa wakes up and starts acting, or Siri. So they're designed to listen continuously for certain triggers. And we could, and some people are working on this actually, use our deep learning techniques to train them to listen for a different sort of trigger. Not a specific word, not something as narrow and fine as that, but the verbal indicators of certain crimes. And in particular, the people who are working on this think this could be a way of detecting domestic violence. So you have these smart microphones in people's houses. Should an argument happen that's starting to get violent and someone's at risk, then these microphones could pick that up. It could trigger them to wake up, to alert the police, possibly send a recording or a live transmission to the police so that the police could act and prevent or at least reduce the harm from that act of violence. Now, the ethical question is, well, that's really hard. Is that good or bad? On the one hand, if you implemented this, it would obviously help reduce harms. Domestic violence is widespread around the world. It's a serious problem, and it causes a lot of harm for people and for the victims. and also the bystanders, who are often children. So obviously, it's good in the sense that it's harm reduction, but it would be bad in other senses. In order to work, these microphones would have to be continually listening for these triggers. There would be a lot of false positives. Inevitably, no system is without its false positives, even if it's 99.9% accurate, there's going to be 1 in 1,000 false positives. And false positives will affect different people differently. I'm white and privileged. If the police came to my house and it was a false positive, I could probably persuade them quite quickly that there wasn't anything for them to act on. People from different social groups, from socially marginalized groups, people who are less articulate and well educated might have harder problems disengaging from the police, and they may end up with criminal records or other problems through a false positive. So there's a risk of harm it creates through false positives, but it also creates another sort of potential harm, which is that these devices, once you set them up so that they can listen for things other than just their keywords, and here that in cooperation with the police, you set them up to do that. Once you set them up like that, then you can extend the sorts of things they're listening for. Governments could start insisting that they listen for subversive speech or politically problematic speech, and they could be used as instruments of control and manipulation in that sense. So it's a really complicated issue, which leads us to the question, who decides? How do we decide whether we make this technology or whether we don't make this technology? And there's a very standard answer, which is that that's not a scientist's question. That's not a scientific question. So if you're the scientist, if you're developing this technology, whichever aspect you're involved in it, it's not your problem what the ethics of it are, because that's not a scientific question. That's not your specialism. You just design it. You let someone else decide whether it should be regulated, whether it should be deployed, what the constraints are. Now, what I hope to persuade you in this webinar is that that's a mistake. That's the wrong way to think about all these questions. And I'll explain, first of all, just a quick overview, but I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining this. So the quick overview answer is this. If you're a scientist, you are a person. You're a person who does science, amongst other things, of course. So science may be value-free. Science may not be good or bad. The technology, if viewed from a scientific point of view, is neither good nor bad. But the activity of doing science isn't value-free, because that involves a person making a decision. And every choice or decision that a scientist makes will to some extent draw upon their personal values, upon what they care about. They're making a choice to do this or that. Our lives are full of choices. And that is where ethics gets into science. It doesn't get in through the science, it gets in through the scientists, through the people who are doing science, making decisions about what to do, what not to do. So that's what I'm going to try and persuade you. But the first kind of response to that might be, well, yes, but surely there are experts on these questions. There are legal experts, and on the ethical question about using smart speakers, smart microphones, here you go. Just last November, there was a paper published in the journal Ethics and Information Technology answering that question. So if there are experts, why can't we just defer to the experts? Well, the experts, like the people who wrote that paper, they're applied ethicists. And what applied ethics does, this academic specialism, is it applies learning from ethical theory to answer these very specific questions. Should we develop these technologies, for example? But the important thing about applied ethics is that it doesn't claim epistemic authority on the answer. So an applied ethicist, obviously, when they come up with an answer to this question, they think they're right, but they don't think that they have some authority to get you to do what they say. There's no authority. They don't have a knowledge base, which means that they're experts in the sense that you can defer your decision to them. Rather, what applied ethics does is it goes through a thought process and it aims to identify good and bad thinking about the question. What are the good reasons to do this? What are the bad reasons? Which ones work? Which ones don't? So they will defend a particular solution because that will follow from, in their minds, from what they're doing. But what they're trying to do is make explicit how to reason to an answer here, what all the considerations are, how to weigh them up. And that process means that when they publish their paper, someone can come along and read that paper and make up their own mind. So you can, if you look at the abstract, you can see what their conclusion is, but you can't just take the conclusion on their authority. What you have to do is you have to read through the paper, look at the reasons they give and how they articulate them, and then make up your own mind on whether that's the right or the wrong answer. So the role of experts in ethics is slightly different to the role of experts in, say, medicine. Experts in medicine know stuff other people don't know. They're never going to be able to learn it in the time they have available in order to make a decision. So they defer their decision. They treat the medical expert as an epistemic authority. The ethics expert isn't an epistemic authority in that sense. They're someone who enables other people to make good ethical choices. Well, I said applied ethics is about applying what we've learned from ethical theory. So let's just talk a little bit about ethical theory so we can understand how that works. So what is ethical theory? Ethical theory isn't the study of right or wrong. It's not telling you what's right or what's wrong. It's telling you, it's studying the thinking that goes into coming to conclusions about what's right, wrong. So it's a study of the structure of thinking about right and wrong. And generally speaking, it divides that thinking into three separate areas. The first area is evaluations. So initially, we can evaluate our options and their outcomes as good and bad, better and worse. These evaluations themselves are just, as it were, applying values, just assessing against values. The second aspect of ethical thinking is not evaluating, but giving reasons. Now, you might think that this being an ethically better option than that gives you a reason to do the first one. And we'll come back to talking about exactly what kind of reason that is. But there are other reasons we have in life. So we can study ethical reasons and how they work and how they interrelate with the other reasons we have. And then the third aspect of ethical theory is looking at rights and duties. And these, not evaluations, they're not reasons, they're constraints on what we may do. So if someone has a right, then that creates a duty on me to respect that right, to enable them to do it, or to not do something else. As I said, there's lots of non-ethical thinking as well, which has this structure, has these three elements. There are non-ethical evaluations. If you say something's fun, you're evaluating it, okay? But it's not an ethical evaluation. Similarly, if you talk about someone being polite or impolite, that's an evaluation, but it's not an ethical evaluation. There are non-ethical reasons. A reason for doing something might be making your mother proud, might be making money. Those are perfectly good reasons to do some things. They're not ethical. It's not they're unethical, it's just they're outside of ethics. And there are also non-ethical rights and duties. Academic integrity is a duty we all have as academics to meet certain standards. That's not an ethical duty, it's an academic duty. Equally, if we think of software as open source or something as having copyright on it, those create certain rights and duties. So there's an important question, which is what makes some values, reasons, and duties ethical, whereas others aren't ethical? And the first answer, what I was taught when I was a student, was that what defines the ethical is its contrast to self-interest. So we've got self-interested evaluations, reasons, duties. I mean, they may be broadly self-interested in a very broad sense, but when we're evaluating someone as polite or impolite, that's in a sense of self-interest. We prefer people to be polite. But when we're thinking ethically, according to this answer, we're deciding not on the basis of our interests, but of, in some sense, other people's interests. And that's what altruism means. It's a contrast to egoism, thinking just about myself, altruism, thinking about the other. But which other people? That's in itself an interesting question. When I'm thinking about the impact of an action on others and whether it's in their interests, should I think just about humans? Should I think about other animal species? So you might think that arguments about what we eat involve thinking about the interests of other animal species. But what about species that aren't on Earth? What if there are alien species? Do their interests matter? Do I have to think only about people who live now, or do I have to think about future people? Are they just the next generation, or all generations? These are really complicated questions. And we actually need ethical thinking to decide where the limits of altruism are, what the shape of altruistic thinking is. So actually, it doesn't look like altruism is the answer to what makes something ethical. Here's some other reasons for thinking the same thing. If everyone's just self-interested primarily, and then when we come to be altruistic, do we take into account other people's self-interest? And then we just do whatever we think, oh, well, that's what they want, that's what they like. We must maximize that, take that into account anyway. Or do we think more about their more objective well-being? Is it actually good for them? A lot of people do things freely and choose to do them, which we might think are not in their own interests. A famous example, currently controversial in British politics, but you'd have to have a very narrow interest in British politics to be aware of that, is smoking. So a lot of people choose freely to smoke. They like smoking tobacco, but it may not be in their well-being. Would an altruist have to stop people smoking or let them smoke? It's not clear. We need ethical thinking to decide that. And then we have other concerns. Other people might care about each other. Is that a self-interest in another person? Is that not being ethical? Is it being ethical? It's very difficult to work it out. So there are lots of problems with this understanding of ethics as just being altruistic. So I'm going to suggest a different approach. I'm going to suggest that ethics can be identified as being based in a certain sort of norm or normative framework. And I'll explain a little bit more about it. But this is a very general explanation of what a normative framework is, and then we'll get into some detailed examples. So a normative framework is a belief system, just a collection of beliefs that someone has, things they think are true, and which has as an output some judgments about what is and is not permissible. So you can have a normative framework. So, for example, a particular set of religious beliefs would be a normative framework, which would determine that some things are permissible and other things are not permissible. So there are lots of normative frameworks about basically any belief system which has that consequence. It generates judgments about what's permissible and not permissible, can be regarded as a normative framework. But because these are belief systems, there's they can be changed. Like all our beliefs, you can engage in a process which modifies and changes that system of belief, maximizing coherence, responding to the evidence, and various other ways we can change belief systems. So if you have a belief system and it generates these judgments, then insofar as you accept that system, I say you internalize or agree with that belief system, then that gives you a reason to do some things and not do other things. And they can also, these belief systems, generate more stronger claims, not just permissions and not what's permissible and what's impermissible, but they can also generate rights, duties. And you might think that the UN Convention on Human Rights is an attempt to state a very, very general belief system and the rights that follow from it, or it's actually an attempt to state the rights that follow from a very general belief system about human nature. Okay, so I want to contrast three different normative frameworks here to help us get back to thinking about issues of ethics when we're trying to develop responsible AI. So I'm going to contrast the legal, the social, and the ethical. I mentioned we also get religious normative frameworks. I'm leaving those on one side. They may, in some societies, be embedded within law or social norms, or they may not be. There are very big variations about how it works. So legal normative frameworks are interesting. You need a government to create laws. Without a government, you don't create laws. We talk about international law, but international law is really just a cooperation agreement between various governments. It doesn't really have the same status as a law created by a national government. So you need a government to create laws, and you need a justice system, courts, judges, police, prisons, etc., to enforce laws. If you create laws without a justice system, they don't work, they don't do anything. And again, it's also an issue around international. And because of that, legal normative frameworks are explicit. They're written down. Of course, they need interpretation, and you can generate not merely the laws created by the government, but also the case law created by judges. But they exist there, they can be referred to. The law isn't there if there isn't some sort of statute, bill, act, or case history that you can appeal to say this is what is permissible and this is what's not permissible. So it's explicit. This contrasts with social norms. Social norms, they also need not necessarily a government, but a society to create and enforce them. Societies can take all sorts of shapes and sizes. They can be quite small and localized. They can be national. They can be supranational. You can have societies and cultures which cross different nations. And they're very loosely formed and largely a matter of self-identification. But social norms need a society to create them. Social norms are the sorts of expectations about what's permissible and what's impermissible, which aren't written down in law, but which everyone in the society is aware of. And in the way that the law needs a justice system to enforce them, social norms also need some mechanism of enforcement. And this is usually through disapproval, social rejection. Again, the social tools. We say ostracize people who don't stick to the social norms. And social norms can change, they're fluid, they develop, they emerge out of general patterns of agreement and consensus in societies. But they're very, very rarely written down. Some might be here or there. And they're learned by experience. They're learned by a process we call socialization, of becoming part of a society. If you move from one society to another, depending how different it is, some of the social norms will transfer, but you will sometimes quite quickly learn differences about what's expected, what's permissible, and what's impermissible. And so as you travel around the world, and tourists traditionally were very bad at being sensitive to social norms. They're now perhaps much more sensitive to social norms, but expatriates, people who relocate, tend to be much better at it. But it's a challenge. So we've got legal norms and social norms, and I want to contrast these with ethical norms. So ethical norms are a different category. They're real. I mean, there is a whole academic discipline we call metaethics, which is trying to explain the sense in which they're real. But they're real in this sense that whatever legal system you live in, whatever society you live in, part of your belief system will allow you to question the legal and social norms. If a new law is proposed, you have some basis on which to think, is that a good or a bad idea? You may actually think that about existing laws. You might question whether that's good or bad to have that law. I mentioned earlier as an example of smoking, laws that ban smoking in certain places. We've got some beliefs. We all have a belief system which allows us to evaluate whether a law which bans smoking inside, for example, is good or bad. And similarly, we can evaluate social norms. That's largely what being a teenager involves. You grow up and you start learning the social norms and that they are social norms. You start understanding that there are different types of behavior. And then you have something which allows you to question those social norms and decide whether you think they're good or bad. That is a belief system which is generating ethical norms. Second feature of ethical norms is that they're acquired in a very similar way to social norms. Ethical thinking is acquired through socialized education, what we often call learning right from wrong. But that's rarely a matter of just learning a list of what's right and wrong. It's learning to think about right and wrong. We teach children the difference between right and wrong by teaching them about the consequences of actions, about harms they might generate, about how other people might feel. That's teaching them ethical thinking. Now, the interesting thing about ethical thinking, as opposed to social thinking, you get taught social norms in a very similar way. Once you've learned the social norms, they're just a fact. It's just a fact that this is permissible in this society. This is impermissible in this society. Once you acquire ethical thinking, then you have a capacity to make up your own mind. Learning ethical thinking is learning the skill of thinking about what should I do? How do I make this choice in a way that allows you to make up your own mind for yourself? But it's not merely making up your own mind, oh, this is what I want. Because you're trying to make up your own mind by thinking ethically, by giving ethical reasons for or against your choice. And ethical reasons are impersonal. So if I say, I want to do this because I like it, because I enjoy it, because it'll make me feel good, that's a personal reason. That refers to me. An ethical reason is an impersonal reason. It's not dependent on anything particular about me, who I am, what I do, where I live. So ethical norms come from that belief system that we acquire through socialized education, giving us a capacity to think critically in terms of impersonal reasons. Right, that's quite a lot. I've got 2 new messages in the chat. I'm just going to check what those are. Good. So let's just give an example of distinguishing between ethical, social, and legal norms. The example I'm going to give is from parenting. It's from a kind of Western tradition of celebrating Christmas by giving presents. But nearly all societies have moments, festivals in the year where we celebrate by giving presents, and in particular presents to children. So it's legally permissible not to give your children any Christmas presents. The law doesn't care whether you give your children Christmas presents or not. It's not something that anyone has written into law. So it's entirely up to parents to choose whether to give their children Christmas presents from the point of view of the law. But certainly in a large number of societies in the West, the social norms of good parenting prohibit it. If you didn't give your children Christmas presents, there'd be a lot of disapproval, ostracization. You'd be much criticized by society. But the odd thing about that is we also have a culture, the Father Christmas culture, where Father Christmas gives presents to children who've been good and not to children who've been naughty. So we've got an ethic here, a Father Christmas ethics, which says, oh, if children have been naughty, they don't deserve presents. Which is an interesting tension with the social norm. The social norm suggests parents should never withhold presents from their children, even if they've been naughty, because they've never been that naughty. Yet we have a whole culture of ethics saying children who've been naughty shouldn't get presents. And then there's a whole set of other ethical norms around presents. So there may be the case that giving certain types of present is ethically unacceptable. It's not necessarily socially unacceptable, it happens widely. But presents which are environmentally damaging, presents which are heavily gendered and reinforce gender stereotypes, presents which are age inappropriate. You shouldn't give a 10-year-old a bottle of whiskey for Christmas. That seems to be an ethical norm as well. So within the space of parenting, we can see how there are legal norms, which are actually very, very permissive. You have to be a very, very bad parent to break the law. Then there are social norms, which are rather less permissive and often very restrictive on parenting. We often see social disapproval of types of parenting, which there doesn't seem to be any ethical problem with. And then we've got these complex set of ethical questions as well, which are much less clear and need to be decided on an individual basis. You need to make up your own mind about whether, if a child's been naughty, you should still give them Christmas presents, about what sort of Christmas presents you give them. So the 3 sets of norms are different. And this is where we need to think about their relations. I'll screen that. So here are 2 Venn diagrams, loosely representing 2 possible relationships between the legally permissible and the socially permissible. So there, in option 1, we have the thought that everything that's socially permissible is legally permissible, though not everything that's legally permissible is socially permissible. So the law is more permissive than society, but society doesn't permit law breaking. And there in option 2, we have a slightly different option, which says, again, the law is more permissive than society, but society does tolerate, permit a certain amount of law breaking. So just pause for a minute and think. Can you think of any examples which fall into that group? Oh, on to the next slide. Yeah, fall into the group of socially permissible, socially acceptable actions which are not legal. Well, I'm sure you're all thinking about it. I will, I'll kind of make some suggestions for this purpose, but it's a good exercise to think through. So take, for example, driving offences. So countries have different rules about driving, but typically you need to have your car insured. The driver needs a valid driving license. And then there are particular rules about how you drive, and in particular speed limits. So thinking again about societies I'm more familiar with, like the UK and Europe and North America, in most of those societies, driving without a valid driving license, definitely illegal, definitely socially impermissible. Driving without insurance, illegal and socially unacceptable. But breaking the speed limit in good driving conditions on an empty road, that seems to be socially permissible. We have some big, wide roads with good visibility. If the driving conditions are good, you do no one any harm, and society seems to tolerate that bit of law breaking. It's fairly trivial, but it is an example where social norms of permissibility allow one to sometimes, in certain circumstances, break the law. There may be other cases. I think there are a lot of other cases like that, where society says it's okay to break some laws in some circumstances. The laws have to be there, but they don't always, it's not always required to break them, to follow them. So if that's right, legal and social permissibility don't quite overlap. What then bringing in the ethical? So we have two Venn diagrams here to look at the relationships if we bring in the ethical. So option 1, again, assumes that everything that's ethically permissible, everything that ethics allows us to do, is legal. It doesn't assume that it's always socially permissible, because we've allowed that that sometimes we may ethically critique social permissibility. So an awful lot of what has happened in the last few decades as people become more aware of environmental consequences of actions, they've started doing ethical critiques of socially acceptable forms of behavior. You can have an ethical critique of eating meat. You can have an ethical critique of driving a car as environmental reasons. While these things still also remain socially permissible. So the interesting question, though, is there a sphere of action which is ethically permissible but not legal, not legally permissible? Now you might think that's obviously wrong. Surely we ethically ought to always obey the law. But we have noticed that ethics at least gives us a position from which we can criticize the law. If we thought that we ought to ethically always obey the law, then we could debate about new laws, whether they should be implemented or not. But once they're implemented, we have to obey them, whether or not we think we should, ethically speaking, whether they're good law. The other view, in option 2, would say that ethical thinking can take us to a position where it's right to break the law. I'm just going to give a couple of examples here, but one, you might think that in certain cases, certain laws are so bad that you need to protest against them, and the only effective form of protest might be some form of civil disobedience. So famous incidents of civil disobedience, perhaps in America, the most famous moment of civil disobedience was what's called the Boston Tea Party, where a group of American settlers dressed up in disguise, they disguised themselves as indigenous Americans, and boarded a ship in Boston Harbor and tipped all the cargo of tea into the harbor as a protest against certain taxation rules. They were breaking the law, but this is seen as a justified breaking of the law, of an act of civil disobedience. Another forms of civil disobedience have occurred at other points in history, and we can find moments of civil disobedience where groups of people have broken the law in order to change things, in order to bring about political change and good, positive political change. The other kind of less dramatic sometimes, but really important area is whistleblowing. Sometimes people are working for organizations which they realize are doing things which are very, very wrong. But their terms of employment, possibly the laws of the country, mean that the only way they can expose this information is by breaking the law. So classically, whistleblowers often have to steal information from the organization in order to expose the wrongdoing. So a whistleblower is clearly ethically motivated. They believe that what they're doing is ethically permissible, but it involves breaking the law. Right, I'm going to take a quick pause there and just check. No questions? Good. So I just want to whiz on to the last few points. What we've been talking about so far is what is and isn't ethically permissible. And I just want to warn against the risk of what's called moral perfectionism. Moral perfectionism is the view that you must always take the ethically best of any two options. Any two options, we ought to do the better one rather than the worse. And that means you're always having to evaluate everything ethically and always just have one best course of action as an option. It simplifies complex choices in the sense that if you can do the working out, you then know what you have to do. But in practice, it means that in real life, almost everyone is always doing wrong. If you go to a shop and you want to buy one can of soft drink or another can of soft drink from a different company, well, it might be the case that one of those companies' business practices, their employment practices, their environmental footprint makes the one choice rather than the other, the ethically preferable choice. But people don't have the ability to find all that out. They don't have the time. It would be an intolerable burden to try to do that with every choice you make in life, which means that most of the time, if you're a moral perfectionist, most people, most of the time, would be doing the wrong thing. And we can contrast that with a slightly different view, which is that being ethically good is good enough. Good is good enough. Okay, so I've been talking about what's permissible. Take whistleblowing as an example. Whistleblowing is ethically permissible. It's clearly better if there's an organization which is doing bad things, if this is revealed. Does that create an obligation for everyone who works for that company or organization to reveal that, to take on those risks of being a whistleblower? No, it's permissible, but for a lot of people, the risks are too high. Their family may depend upon their job. They may not be able to personally deal with the stress and the difficulties that that'll produce. There may be lots of reasons. So there could be ethical reasons to do it, and then some other non-ethical reasons. And as long as both courses of action are ethically permissible, then it's up to the individual to balance it and make a choice, work out what is good enough for them. So I would like to have a few minutes at the end to take questions. I'm going to just go back to our example of the smart microphones, domestic violence or intimate partner violence, as it's sometimes called. Okay, we said that's a really hard question. Is this a good, should we be developing this technology? Should we be using this technology? Or are its negative effects or its potential negative effects too problematic? I think that's the wrong question. The social theorist, Franzberg, first law of technology was that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And there's something really important in that insight, which is that asking, is this technology good or bad, is the wrong question. The better questions to ask are the questions about what choices do I make, given what's ethically permissible, the range of actions that are permissible for me, what should I do? So should I contribute to developing this technology? Suppose you're a machine learning expert, a deep learning expert, and someone invites you or asks you to work in their lab where they're developing this technology. Should you do it? And that's a personal decision. It's an ethical decision, but it's a personal decision. And different people will come with different answers to that question. Or similarly, if the technology exists, someone asks you to help them implement it, deploy it. Should I contribute to that? And if it is deployed, should I contribute to regulating it? We can all contribute to regulating it through civil society, through campaigning for greater regulations, or we could do it professionally. So these are better questions because they're questions which allow you to weigh up the different constraints that might come into your decision making. To not assume moral perfectionism, you always have to do the best thing. To say, well, look, it's permissible to work, to take the job you need to take in order to support your family. Okay, if it means working to develop a technology which has some good uses and some bad uses, that looks like it's permissible. Obviously, if it's a technology that could only be used for bad, that wouldn't be permissible, and so on. So you would need to make those decisions yourself. You can't ask someone else to make those decisions for you. You can go and read applied ethics on how to think about these questions, what arguments can be given for and against deciding one way or the other. But ultimately, it becomes a matter of personal responsibility and making those choices. An exercise to think about would be deepfake technology. It's much more widespread, and there are a lot more opportunities to have to make these decisions. So would you work for an organization which was developing the technologies which enable deepfakes? It's an interesting question. Is there any, would they be developing things which actually have any positive use? And one might think that they can have positive use. We saw that in a recent election in Pakistan, that the leader of one of the parties, Imran Khan, was in prison. And they used deepfake technology to enable him to deliver speeches in order to contribute to the campaign. Now, whether you think that's right or wrong, there's at least a case to be made that was a good use of that technology. There are other sorts of questions. It does exist. Should you be involved in the companies that create apps and services to employ this? Again, it looks like if there are permissible uses of this technology, it could be ethically permissible to do that, and it's a difficult decision. And finally, should you contribute some way to regulating it through policy advice or political campaigns? My voice is going. Right, I'm going to stop there. These are kind of questions for self-reflection. But I'm going to say, are there any questions for me while I leave those up on screen? Because we've got just under 10 minutes. If anyone would like to ask any questions, pop them in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to ask. You can think about these questions. So, these are questions for self-reflection. If you're thinking about your role in responsible AI, think about your choices that you've made. What they say about you. That's the starting point. Excellent. Hi, Nat. Can an AI ever be morally responsible for some action now or in the future? Great question. Incredibly difficult. I think in the future, yes. But that's my view about what the pathway we need to do. We're not developing, but we could develop towards a more sophisticated form of AI would be. Now, well, this is quite interesting. We've actually had the first ever legal ruling, which suggests, which was that an AI chatbot working for Air Canada generated the same sorts of legal responsibilities as if it had been a human giving advice. So whether the AI, how you treat that in terms of it as an individual being responsible in the way that an employee as an individual might be responsible for giving bad advice is slightly different, a different question. But it's certainly true that in this case, in the Air Canada case, the AI chatbot, it made up a policy. It did give a link to the correct policy, but it stated incorrectly what the policy was, and that it was much more generous than the actual policy. And this went to court, and it was decided that the company should be responsible for this, just as if it had been a real person rather than an AI. So that's with the fairly simple sort of large language models we're running at the moment. We're beginning to see legal responsibility there, and I think we can find other forms of responsibility emerging with a little bit more development. Okay, question on regulation. Excellent question. So I think neither is sufficient, neither ethics nor regulation. It's really important to realize regulation's always going to be, you say, stringent regulation to come. It's always after the fact. It's always too late. Regulation is always local. One country could regulate more stringently than another. Then the technologies would still be developed. They'd still be available. We're in global. So we don't want to stop regulating, but AI ethics is going to be much more important than regulation because it's going to help prevent the bad things happening before the regulation gets there, or it's going to minimize them. So yeah, excellent question. I think the more everyone involved in AI starts thinking ethically about all the choices they're making. Now, if someone offers you a lot of money, ask them why they're offering you so much money for that job, and think hard about these questions of taking your personal responsibility for choosing to do that or not choosing to do that. Yeah, excellent question. Any more? Yeah, another talk would be what we need to do with our existing large language models to bring them much more into the sphere of responsibility, of potentially moral responsibility. And as far as I know, being able to track down, no one's working in that space yet. I did try to get some money for a project in that area, but sadly didn't get it. I've just got a couple of minutes left. Any last questions? Brilliant. Well, I think it's okay. Another excellent question. Part of the point of what I'm trying to explain in this talk is that a lot of AI ethics, as done by so-called experts, isn't very practical. But it becomes practical when you change the idea that there's an expert here, and you say what we're trying to do, what people in AI ethics should be doing, is giving the people who are working in AI, giving the engineers and the managers and the product developers the ability and the power, the skills to make the right choices as an individual. And it's seeing that everyone has to make those choices. Every choice you make has some consequences, has an ethical dimension. And actually understanding how to make those choices is much more practical. So I'm a great fan of not doing AI ethics, an abstract thing, which then tells people what to do. So like the value alignment problem, which values do we align our AI to? Bad question. Okay, it's like saying if you think, if you are a parent, you try to instill values in your children, those come from you. So if you're running a company and you're building an AI, you shouldn't outsource the question of which values do I align it with. They come from you and your values as an organization and as individuals in that organization. And that then becomes very practical. But it's refers to that second question up on screen. Are you prepared to take responsibility for those choices? And an awful lot of AI ethics is about the people developing and deploying this technology trying to not take responsibility themselves. They're saying, I'm being responsible by asking an expert, and then I don't have to think about it myself. That's when it becomes impractical. Yeah, great question, really interesting. Any other questions for the chat? We're coming up to the end. Oh yeah, the big letter to that was a wonderful exercise in trying to manipulate public opinion. So if you think about it, what was happening in that situation is a group of people who were running organizations who were competing with each other in order to develop new technologies, new AI technologies as fast as possible, realized that there were a lot of risks they weren't taking into account. And they said, well, we're not taking into account because the competition's so fierce, we just have to go ahead. And so we want someone else to tell us to stop. So this is a group of people who are competing with each other, have come together and realized that their collective behavior is really, really dangerous. And instead of then taking the next step, which would be to sit down like adults, if a group of adults realize they're doing something collectively which is dangerous, they pause, they stop, they reflect, they try to change their behavior. Instead of doing that, they kind of said, oh, someone please stop us. There, of course, is no organization which could have stopped them. what they were asking for, there is no government, there's no world government which could have done that. So it was pointless because there was no regulation that could have stopped that, but also it was the wrong solution. If they could get themselves together to all agree that there was this risk, why couldn't they get themselves together to stop doing what they were doing themselves? They didn't need regulation to do that. What they needed to do was stop saying, we must all, to break out of the cycle of competition for market share, which is effectively what they were doing. So they got themselves into a very strange position. And I see that as ethical immaturity. Asking to be regulated because you know what you're doing is bad is a very ethically immature approach. If you know what you're doing is bad, then you have it within you, whether it's as an individual or in that case as a group of people, to do something about it. But it's a really interesting situation. Yeah, so we need regulation, but it's never going to be as effective as getting people to see themselves as agents who are making moral choices in these matters. Right, thank you now. Well, we've reached the end of the time. I've enjoyed that greatly. Thank you for listening, everyone. I'm going to stop the share so we can just say goodbye. That's great. I believe this recording will be made available in future. And my name is almost Google unique. So if you want to get in touch with me, yeah, you can probably find me. Nice to talk to you all. And thanks very much for your questions.